Hi, I'm Mansi Phadke, Deputy Editor with ThePrint, and joining me today is Daniel Bögre Udell. He's the co-founder of WikiTongues. It's a very interesting non-profit organization based in the United States. It works at documenting languages and rejuvenating them. And because of India's richness in that department, a conversation about preserving languages and documenting them is always interesting. So thank you, Daniel, for joining us today. And Daniel will be speaking on Sunday at the TEDx Mumbai event. We've managed to catch him for a short chat just before that. Why don't we begin by you telling us a little bit about how WikiTongues exactly works?
Sounds good, and thank you for having me. WikiTongues directly supports the leaders of new mother tongue initiatives. Once a year, we post an open call for language revitalization projects. We select a cohort of people to work with on an annual basis, and we give them grants, training, and a year of in-kind support as they work to identify their community's long-term and short-term language needs, develop a plan to implement those needs, and we help them implement the short-term needs within a year and make sure that they're equipped to implement the long-term needs over time, because language revitalization is effectively the process of a community reversing language endangerment for themselves. It's the process of ensuring that your language is sufficiently preserved so that it can be learned. It's the process of teaching adults to be new fluent speakers. It's the process of raising children as new native speakers. And it's the process of creating kind of contemporary or modern, if you will, contexts to use the language on a daily basis. And so it's a generational process that takes a very long time. In addition,
Yeah, I mean, your organization has at least started the process. So that's really good to hear. And you started it in 2014, right? So what prompted you to, come up with a concept like this?
I was raised natively speaking English, but I'm not English. So while English is my mother tongue, it's not my ancestral language. I have a couple ancestral languages because my mother and father come from different cultural backgrounds. But on my father's side, his parents were speakers of Yiddish, which is the traditional language of Ashkenazi Jews. So this is Jews from Eastern and Central Europe. He would use a lot of Yiddish with me growing up, like vernacular Yiddish, like little phrases and things like that. And so I think that subtly planted an interest in, under-resourced or endangered languages. But my mother was very keen on me becoming multilingual, and so she encouraged me to learn Spanish. And in the process of learning Spanish, I lived in Spain, where there are a few very successful language revitalization cases in regions where they speak languages other than Spanish. And one of those regions is Catalonia. And I lived in Catalonia learning Catalan alongside Spanish. And I think that's what got me thinking more proactively about linguistic diversity and why it's important to maintain it.
And so you mentioned that your organization gave grants to cohorts for revitalization projects. So what kind of projects have in the nearly 9 or 10 years that you've been around? What sort of projects have you worked on?
Yeah. Well, I should clarify that even though we began in 2014, we didn't start directly supporting language revitalization until 2021. We initially started as a crowdsourcing project where we encouraged people to send videos of their mother tongue or of a language from their community, and we would archive that documentation and post it online. And we still do that. In fact, in the past 3 months, we've gotten something like 300 videos of different languages from around the world. But since 2021, we've also been offering this direct support to language revitalization leaders, and we've worked with 40 projects so far. And they really, really run the gamut. For example, last year in Uttarakhand, we worked with a project for the Raji language, which is a language that has about 900 remaining speakers. And the woman who started this revitalization project is from the Raji community. Her name is Tulsi Rajbar. And she was focusing on mother tongue education for children because she identified over 12 months, she organized a series of pop-up language classes across 5 Van Raji villages, created an alphabet reader for the language's indigenous script, and started also training other adults to be teachers. That's one project. But they can take a lot of different forms. So, for example, this year in the United States, we're working with a Choctaw computer scientist. Choctaw is a language, an indigenous language from the United States, one of the indigenous European nations. And she is working on expanding she's building a data corpus for her language, but what that is really doing is laying the groundwork for it to be possible to expand multilingual AI to her language. So language revitalization can take a lot of different forms. And it usually breaks down into 5 categories. There's linguistic documentation, childhood education, adult education, content, and technology. And so they can really work in any of those areas depending on how endangered the language is, what kind of media and technology the community uses, and who in the community is still speaking the language. And when you look at these kinds of things, you can start to understand, okay, what is language revitalization going to look like for us?
Right. And revitalizing a language, revitalizing a language doesn't, it's not just limited to revitalizing a language. It opens, one's to a community's culture, literature. So have you had some of those experiences when, you've had a success story where a community has picked up a language again and, reconnected with its roots in some way?
Yeah, I was actually having a very interesting conversation with one of our new the Mayan community in Guatemala, and he was telling me that the revitalization of that language has also kind of reignited an interest in traditional fashion, traditional textile. And I've seen in other cases, if there are, maybe historical art forms that are not as widely practiced anymore, the language to renewed interest in that. And that's because language really is the vehicle of a culture, right? It expresses a way of, and when you start remembering your language, your community's language, you're going to start remembering other things that your community used to do before they were forced to give up their language. And I say forced because language endangerment usually is the result of economic exclusion, political oppression, violence, colonization. This is not, contrary to popular belief, a natural or inevitable result of something like globalization. It's got a much darker source.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And what are the kind of challenges that you commonly face when you try to document or revitalize a particular language?
Probably the biggest challenge is honestly distance and the inequitable distribution of internet, right? So some communities have much better internet access than others, and we can do a lot more with the ones who have really solid internet access. We were working with last year revitalization leader in Mali in West Africa, and he was working on a Dogon language. There's a handful of Dogon languages. They're all very closely related. And he was doing a kind of massive oral history project in one of the in one of the more endangered varieties of Dogon, and recording very, very important oral histories from the country's civil war in the 1900s. And his internet access wasn't as good as other people doing oral history projects that we've worked with. And so unfortunately, it was a lot harder for him to actually archive the materials, to transcribe and translate them, right? So this is kind of the thing that the biggest challenge I think that we've seen is the kind of inequitable access to kind of very important infrastructure. But I would say that language revitalization as a whole is just the generational time scale.
Okay.
It takes a very long time, and it can be difficult to keep up with it for a 30, 40, 50-year period. Right now, we just started a new cohort. So when I say we've worked with 40 projects so far, that includes 21 projects we're working with this year. Okay. Last year we worked with 15, and the year before that we worked with 5. Now, of the 19 projects that we finished working with, an overwhelming majority, something like 80%, are still active, right? And that's wonderful. Will they still be active in 50 years? I hope so.
And with different dialects and scripts, is that a challenge as well?
Yeah, for some languages, sure. So I'm going to break that into 2 parts. There's the dialectal diversity, and then there's writing systems.
Right.
Where dialectal diversity can be challenging is, inevitably, perhaps a little ironically, some degree of linguistic standardization can be helpful to a language revitalization project. And the reason for that is if you're going to be teaching adults, if you're eventually going to be teaching children, if you're going to be creating learning resources that are not just raw linguistic documentation, and raw linguistic documentation is like an oral history, a video of someone speaking, whatever, right? If you're going to be creating that stuff, there is a version of the language that you need to agree on teaching. Correct. And dialectal diversity is kind of the natural state of every language. Some more than others, though. Some it can get really, really different. And so it sometimes causes problems in a community when they're trying to revitalize their language, and we can't agree on which dialect is going to be the standardized version. So there are different solutions to that. Sometimes what will happen is they will actually just create a new standardized dialect, and maybe it's based off one of the dialects, or it borrows from a few of the others. I think a very prominent case of this is the Basque language in Spain, which I don't know how widely known that is here, but the Basques are very interesting. Their language is older than Latin, so they're kind of the only culture that survives the Roman colonization of the Iberian Peninsula. And I think they ended up creating a new standardized dialect that's loosely based off of one of the dialects, but has some input from others. But what can that can eventually lead to the loss of the native dialects, right? And when that becomes kind of the new thing that people speak natively. Another thing I've seen, and I think this can be a very good.
And have you worked with any Indian languages so far?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, last year we worked with the Raji language in Uttarakhand, which that was a really, really exciting project. This year in our current cohort, we have a couple languages from India as well. We're working with an Angika project. The Angika language, we're working with the Gisari project, the Gisari language. The Angika project is super cool. The woman running that project is named Amrit Sufi, and she is doing a lot of work getting the Angika language online, creating contemporary resources in the language. The most notable example of which would probably be an Angika language Wikipedia. So that's a really, really cool project. The Gisari language project is also very interesting because Gisari is, I've talked to some people in Mumbai who are familiar with it, but it's a language that hasn't yet been fully classified. So it doesn't have an ISO code. There is some linguistic literature that incorrectly refers to it as a dialect of Gujarati or something. And their history is a very unfortunate history. They were persecuted all the way back to British rule. They were considered one of the criminal or outlaw tribes. I forget what that law was in the 1800s, but that kind of created a marginalizing context for them, and that hasn't really fully been remediated or repaired. And so the woman leading that project, Deepa, she's actually the first person, or I think the first person in her community to have a PhD. And so what she's doing is actually putting together some of the very necessary linguistic documentation to actually classify the language. And that might sound overly, academic. Why does that matter? If you don't have an ISO code, it can be actually very hard to, if not impossible, to get your language fully digitized, because browsers, things like that, like web browsers, actually recognize languages based on ISO code. It also, when you have an ISO code, that lends a certain degree of political credibility to the language. So, for example, we worked with an indigenous language in Taiwan last year that didn't have an ISO code, but once they did, that made it easier for them to lobby their local government for recognition and resources, because they said, look, linguists, UNESCO, academia, they recognize us. So those are two projects that we're working with in India. We're also working, if we zoom out and look at South Asia, we're working with the language in Bangladesh. We're working with a very interesting Newad project, which is Newad is the language from Nepal.
One final question before we sign off. I think you've been in India for a day now, 24 hours?
No, I've been here for about 3 days.
Oh, 3 days. Lovely. So how many different Indian languages have fallen on your ears in these 3 days?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, at least Marathi and Hindi.
Okay.
At least Marathi and Hindi. Unfortunately, I've been at this hotel working on my talk for the TEDx event, so I haven't been out and about as much. But definitely at least Marathi or Hindi. I was talking to a Telugu speaker last night. I was talking to a Malayalam speaker last night. I don't know if I heard them speaking, but I know that was their language.
Right.
Right. So at least that. But what I can say is when I came to India in 2019, on a more just kind of traveling, exploring trip, and I was in Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, and Shantiniketan. I mean, dozens of languages fell on my ears over the course of that trip, because South Asia is one of the world's most linguistically dense regions, and that's why one thing that I hope we can build at WikiTongues is, as we grow this revitalization program, it's very important to me that we can kind of guarantee support for different regions of the world, and I would love to have within that a kind of dedicated track where every year, we're guaranteeing, at least 10 cohort members are from, India, Nepal, Bangladesh, because this is a very, very linguistically diverse place.
That's a really good thought. Thank you so much. Or I would say bahut shukriya for joining us today.
Thank you, or as we could say in one of my ancestral languages, Yiddish, Ashenam Dunk.
Oh, Ashim Dank. Thank you so much.